Andres, thank you for joining me.
Happy New Year as always, Kai. I think we should have a good call today.
Okay, so let's jump straight into it. Digital experience composition. What's all this? A new buzzword for this industry? This is unheard of.
Yeah, exactly. So digital experience composition, or DXC for short, it's the latest buzzword in the digital experience space. We're familiar, like this is just a common thing that happens in the space. So the first kind of mention of it came in Gartner's hype cycle for digital commerce back in July of last year. And they said digital experience composition is a step toward complete composability, providing a packaged business capability for a composable experience. And then also in Innovation Insight for Digital Experience Composition, also in July, they said digital experience composition is an emerging market focused on digital multi-experience orchestration in an API-first, headless, decoupled, composable world. So it's a hugely confusing term if you're new to the space.
It is. On one hand, it is. On the other hand, I'm going to say something. You tell me whether you think I'm right or not.
Yeah.
It sounds like to me Gartner has recognized, obviously, this is basically Mac, right? Gartner has recognized the Mac movement. They've also recognized from that messaging, those two quotes you just read out, in my back of my mind, I'm just thinking that's Mac Alliance, right? There's Mac architecture, but there's also, they seem to have picked up on this whole Mac Alliance's definition of what Mac is.
Yeah.
Okay. Specifically because they said, to a step towards complete composability. The fact that they put complete in there is actually significant because this is something that I think Mac Alliance is going to be talking a lot more about this year. But I've heard some of their, leadership saying that something that's on the forefront of their minds is educating the space about what composability is, what Mac is, and what it isn't. There are products out there that have API first, products as part of their suite, or it's possible to have a composable sort of version of that product. Mac Alliance is very clear that they want to make a distinction and they want to educate the market that is not Mac in as far as their definition is concerned.
Yeah.
Their definition is total and complete, Mac principles being applied across a company's spectrum of products, right? Which obviously excludes your site cores, your sales forces, so on and so forth. Okay.
Yeah.
Gartner's digital experience composition is a step towards complete composability. For me, my head's just ringing like Mac Alliance there.
Yeah.
So I find that very, very interesting. What do you think? Do you think I'm right? Or
yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head exactly there. So I was actually in a webinar hosted by Mac Alliance earlier today. It was like the rise of digital experience composition, yes. And it's a few 4 panelists, including Mac Alliance chair Kelly Coach, and one of the things that they kind of harped on is, so they do recognize themselves that there is a lot of confusion as to what term is which, like, is this composable? Is that not composable? And I think if we think about it, like when composable as a concept, the composable DXP movement, all that stuff first came about, it aligned with what Mac and Mac Alliance is. But I think over the last year or so, probably longer, that's started to become a bit more muddled as like larger players like SitePoint started to enter into the space and how they wanted to find composable. So I think we're not in a case where DXC is a move towards trying to clarify what is Mac as it relates to composable and what isn't as it relates to composable. But I think one thing that is clear is the larger problem that they're all trying to solve, which is moving away from bulky, expensive monolithic platforms and giving back marketers, content authors, like non-technical users, back that freedom and ease of use that they were accustomed before, like headless first came on the scene. So I think the problem is clearly defined, like what we're trying to solve, but educating about what's the best solution is still, we're still in the early stages of that.
For sure. And if anything, you mentioned confusion. I'm looking at your notes here. You've mentioned confusion a few times, and that is, that's a good word to describe like how a lot of customers feel right now. Yeah. Whether they're with a monolith today, or they're deciding to leave the monolith, or to stay with it, or to explore this whole headless and Mac thing, they're confused because a lot of the, we said bulky, expensive monolithic platforms, again, no names at this point, they also are using similar terms or the same terms, right, to describe themselves, right? And this is what Mac Alliance is sort of irked by, and you know, they're trying to sort of educate the enterprise customers or what, you know, what's what and where the lines are drawn, right? Whereas you've got the other push from, quite frankly, much bigger companies with much bigger budgets pushing their own agenda onto these terms and saying, hey, we also sort of tick all the boxes, so no problem, right? Yeah. So there's confusion, there's chaos, right? Customers don't know which one to pick, which one sort of suits them best. They're not sure where the sort of buzzword ends and where it begins, right? Yeah. So, like I mentioned before, at the forefront of Mac Alliance's mind, I think for this year is going to be educating customers about this. I think it's going to also be at the forefront of, you know, moving away from just Mac Alliance. It's going to be quite a Mac Alliance focused podcast, I guess. But moving towards just like talking to agencies, talking to just vendors, those who are headless vendors, headless commerce vendors, headless CMS vendors, those who are part of the alliance and those who are not part of the alliance, they're facing the same issue, right? They're going after the same kind of customers, and they're having these same issues where, you know, Sitecore are saying, hey, we're also headless, we're also a DXP, so on and so forth. Salesforce have got products. They're also, you know, talking about composability. So how do those vendors educate the enterprises and the large companies they're trying to win business from, essentially? It's a tough question. Agencies, similarly, we work with some agencies that are, you know, very, very close with Sitecore, for example. They're currently exploring exactly how to navigate this. There's a lot of confusion and chaos in the market. And from our perspective, as sort of like a third party looking in, I think the missing piece here for everybody is like understanding the entire landscape and then being able to translate that into, you know, how can I put it? Translate it into content or messaging that resonates with that enterprise, because the enterprises don't come to the agencies or the vendors and say, hey, we're looking for a Git-based headless CMS. They quite rarely would come with that sort of specific ask. What they come and ask is saying, hey, look, we've got like these 702 websites and microsites. We're in X amount of countries and regions. We've got these issues, these struggles. Help, you know, what can you do to help us, right? And then it's usually the agency that comes along and says, hey, this solution can help. A combination of these solutions can help, and they sort of guide that process, right? It's rare that the customer is sort of using all the buzzwords that we sort of in the industry kind of know about. So I think, you know, agencies have a huge role to play here, right? They're sort of that first step towards the enterprise customer figuring out what's going on, right? And the agency sort of leads them down the path that they feel is best for the client, right? So I think chaos and confusion is the word, the two words. And I think, you know, building more partnerships, building more avenues of communication, having more sort of data out there on who's doing what and how they're doing it will also help. But it's going to be kind of like a battle of who can get their messaging out the best and the fastest at the moment, because these monoliths who, you know, you would say don't quite fit into the mold of what Gartner has said. They could do a pretty good job of almost fitting in, and they'll do an even better job of making sure that messaging that they almost fit it is spread far and wide. Right? That's the danger that the more Mac aligned vendors and agencies will sort of be looking at and sort of fearing.
And I do think, and this is something you mentioned as well, that no prospective company is coming to a vendor or agency or whatever and say, we want this specific thing. Even in the article we feature on the DXP Report, they highlight that fact, like no companies coming out saying, hey, we want DXC, we want this specifically. They come with their problem, and it's up to the agency to say, no, this really can fit here, this really can fit here. And I think even the other thing too, and this is what they kind of highlight on the webinar as well, that this is something that Mac Alliance and Mac focused vendors are very aware of. Like they know that probably not a lot more are asking about Mac, but the DXC thing, even Compose, they're not directly asking, hey, we want XYZ on that, unless they've done all the research already and surveyed the landscape. But most companies don't have time for that. They go to the analysts, they go to the digital agencies to help them figure that out. So education and clarification is going to be very important in the next coming months, I think.
I agree. And, sort of having a centralized place, and, this is something that we're working on, having some sort of centralized place to really review the landscape and understand who's who and what's what, and which vendor is working with which agency and vice versa is also going to be important. And I think something like that where, and again, we're working on something like this, where agencies can also figure out, okay, we're working with like these 2 or 3 vendors. We've been working with them for 5 years. Yeah. It's working. But now, with this whole Mac thing, things are opening up even more. We want interoperability with a whole bunch of different sort of types of tools out there. The monolith that we're working with, the customers are shaky and not sure what's happening. So they want to sort of expand their scope. And it's difficult for them to even decipher who's going to work best with us, right? Okay, we really enjoy working with React. Who's the best headless CMS for us to sort of partner with and bring them some projects on that sort of React based? They don't know themselves, right? Because they've been so focused with their monolith for the last, half a decade or decade. Mm-hmm. They don't really understand like all this new stuff. And you have like DXC coming out of nowhere. It's like, man, is a new category now. So having some sort of centralized hub to find out what the landscape is, who's inside the landscape, and what does each player do is going to be important, I think. Yep. And that's something we're going to try and address this year. But let's move on to our next story, which is Check's notes, also about Mac Alliance. What are they doing?
Yeah, so Mac Alliance actually have 2 new members. So first is Adyen. It's a fintech platform. They do end-to-end payments for data and financial management all in one single platform. And they joined Mac Alliance recently as a member. And also Google Cloud Platform GCP, they've joined as an enabler and it's based on some of the categories that Mac Alliance has in terms of their membership. They have company members, ambassadors, enablers, and these categories fit. So enablers essentially support or enable like Mac companies to do what they do. So other members have like AWS and Vercel, Netlify, MongoDB. So it's just, I think it's just another checkpoint, like another
milestone.
Another milestone for the Mac Alliance here and getting these sort of members joining. So that's huge.
I agree. It is huge. And it's kind of like I had the same feeling last year when AWS became a member. That was when AWS became a member. I'll be honest. That's when before that I was kind of like not sure what's going on with this. Yeah. When AWS joined, my ears perked up and I was like, okay, this is a serious movement, right? And in the enablers category, I believe there's Netlify in there, Vercel in there, and a few others, and sort of like the hosting sort of sphere. And now Google Cloud is joining. It's further. My stance on the Mac Alliance has definitely changed over the last year, just because of like the type of members they've been attracting and what the members have been saying, right? So, for example, Chris Coyler, the worldwide head of retail industry partnerships at Google Cloud, in the press release, he said, the Mac Alliance has quickly become the face of advocacy when it comes to pushing for a new standard for IT architectural excellence. We see the future in headless and composable commerce, and it's important for us to be a part of the community to which a number of our partners belong. Through our membership, we can truly support these partners while championing open and cloud-native technology ecosystems as they grow in relevance and competence. Yeah. I mean, this is Google Cloud saying that, right? This is like, I mean, there comes a point where I had to abandon my initial thoughts about what the Mac Alliance was and could have been. And then when you've got like, higher ups in AWS and Google Cloud saying things like this, it's like really, I've got to abandon what I thought this was about and just say, okay, this is not just this Mac architecture thing, but this Mac Alliance thing is a real movement with real influence, right? Yeah. To temper that, because it does seem like a Mac Alliance sponsored podcast, I want to reiterate the challenges they have, right? I want to reiterate the challenges they have. The challenges being, I'll just reiterate what we've already said. There are more challenges, but I'll reiterate what we've already said, which is on the other side of the fence, there's big players with more market share than even all the Alliance combined, with big budgets, sort of trying to muscle their way in onto the same buzzwords and keywords, which is why we're seeing this sort of hot potato thing happening with buzzwords. Because once one kind of gets a bit diluted or poisoned, quote unquote poisoned.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we need a new edge to put in our sales assets, right? Because that seems to be the case. So it's a big challenge for them, and I think education and having a lot more sort of just like data available to both agencies, vendors, and customers. The data's got to be available to them to sort of look at the market and say, okay, if I'm based in Singapore or I'm based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, who's like the most suited agency for me in this part of the world, and similarly, who's the most suited vendor for me in this part of the world, and what can they offer me? Have they got technology partners in the commerce space, in the analytics space? Do they work together well? Is there any reviews around that? All that kind of stuff, right? Because right now it's a very murky. You type in DXP, you type in head of CMS. There's a barrage, there's pages and pages of companies who tell you they'll all check the same boxes as each other, and they'll all do it better than each other, right? And it's like, well, where do you go? Like, where is that first step? Do you just trust an agency who has been a partner of one of these platforms for a number of years? You know what they're going to recommend to you, right? If they are a Umbraco agency, then you know who they're going to recommend as the solution to your problems, right? But is that truly the case? Not to throw any shade at Umbraco, but there needs to be some sort of centralized yet at the same time decentralized place for people to educate themselves about the landscape, essentially. And I think Mac Alliance have to tackle that. And if they don't, they're going to sort of struggle to win this battle against a very, very high budget adversaries, actually, not just one adversary, adversaries. Yeah. So that was just to prove that we're not sponsored by them.
Yeah,
because this one's been a bit.
Yeah. And one more thing I would like to add on that. I noticed one thing is that a lot of these, as I think we can say probably Mac Alliance are the ones leading the charge and trying to define what composable, DXC, all that stuff is. Other than Gartner, in terms of other than an analyst firm, they're the ones leading the charge on that. I think another thing that has to be noted is that they need to also, and this goes for vendors as well. We all know that these vendors are competing against each other, obviously. But at the same time, there needs to be, and I guess Gartner ultimately will be the ones to define this, but there needs to be a specified definition of what everything is, because there are some vendors who might describe themselves as headless, hybrid, composable, and then another vendor describes themselves as composable in a different way, or they might describe themselves as something else. And not only does that confuse potential companies even more, it also makes it say okay, so if there's 3 different definitions of what a composable DXP or whatever it is, what's the real one? So who's to say what the real one is? So I think that's going to be a challenge for the industry.
Yeah. It is a challenge. It's been a challenge for years. I don't think there's a real solution to it. And I'll tell you why, because this is going to be a bit of a longer podcast, it seems. Usually it's Gartner the one to come out, or maybe for us to come out with some sort of definition. Like for DXP, for example, you can go look at the definition of DXP that they put out a couple of years back, or maybe longer than that. And that is, you could say that is, the definition of what DXP is. But then again, you have companies that sort of adjust it a little bit and they pivot it a little bit this way to make sure they fit into it. And the definition gets diluted, and it's like, well, whose argument is best for what a DXP is what it basically becomes. So that's kind of going to be the same story with any buzzword that comes around. It's a tough one. You're right. I just don't know what the solution is to it, because it's just again, even these big monoliths have adopted some of these terms that you would have thought would be totally exclusive to the sort of pure headless CMSs on the market, or the sort of the microservices sort of players. And yet still the monoliths have managed to take that and say, no, actually, we've made a few acquisitions and we fit in that category too now. So it's very, very difficult. Very, very difficult. Which is why I think, if anything, the buzzwords need less. There needs to be less emphasis on these buzzwords, right? Because even if you look at this Gartner, definition, right? How different is it from DXP? I also have to ask a question: is Gartner sort of complicit in the confusion and chaos in the market? Right? digital experience composition is a step towards complete composability, providing a packaged business capability for a composable experience. How different is that to the DXP definition I had from a few years back?
Yeah.
You know, someone reading that just like off the cuff, what's the difference really? And yet they've got two different definitions for it. Is there an overlap? Is there not an overlap? So, you know, I'm not even a fan of this whole, like, you know, Gartner's put out a new buzzword. What's their definition of it? And let's try and follow that. Just like, I'm not really sure that does anything anymore. I think it's just become too confusing. And again, I'll come back to what I think the solution is, which is some sort of centralized place where the data is freely available for people to make their own analysis, make their own judgments of the landscape, who they can partner with, who they could use, who they should avoid, just based on their own personal, their own business needs, basically. We're going to have to cut it here because I've got a hard stop, but this was an interesting conversation. And I think we'll have a few more of these conversations over this year because I think it's going to be an interesting one for you know, the Mac Alliance and the broader Mac space in general.
Yep, definitely.
But yeah, Andres, thanks for your time.